Welcome back to also cybersecurity episodes with Cyber Queen. Imagine this. An employee working remotely from a coffee shop logs into your company's cloud system on an unsecure public Wi-Fi. Unknowingly to them, a cybercriminal nearby is actually intercepting their login credentials, and before long, your sensitive company data is at risk or perhaps even compromised. Now, scenarios like this happen every single day. And with the rapid shift to hybrid work, they're becoming even more common. Hi, I'm Venicia. I'm the founder of Cyber Queen. I'm a cloud security architect and a Microsoft MVP. And together with Also, we bring you cybersecurity insights packed with the latest news and diverse perspectives. Don't forget to check out the Also Cloud Marketplace for more awesome insights. Alright, now let's dive a little bit deeper into how you can prevent common cyber threats like these by using advanced access control features in Microsoft 365. Now, by using tools like security defaults, conditional access policies, and identity protection, you can make sure that the right people on the right devices have access from the right locations to your critical resources. Now, we'll also take a look at how to monitor and audit access to really try and catch those suspicious events and activities before they can cause any harm. First up, let's look at security defaults in Microsoft 365. Not every business has the time or resources to configure complex security policies. And that's where security defaults in Microsoft 365 come in. These are built-in baseline protections that ensure that every user is secure without needing to configure an extensive amount of policies. If we look at a real-world problem or use case here, you can consider an SMB without a dedicated IT team. They may not have appropriately configured access controls, which leaves their business exposed to all types of phishing attacks or brute force attacks, inauthentic or unauthentic login attempts, etc. So with security defaults, multi-factor authentication for all users is actually automatically enforced. This also helps in blocking legacy authentication to prevent cybercriminals from exploiting old and insecure login methods. Alright, let's have a brief look at how you can enable security defaults in your Entra ID platform. Remember, you can go to Microsoft Entra ID in either Microsoft Azure, so portal.azure.com, and you can navigate to Entra ID, or in your Microsoft Entra Admin Center, so you go to entra.microsoft.com. That's how you can access your Entra configuration. Now, from here, if you want to look at security defaults, remember, security defaults is possible for any license model, so you don't have to be an identity P1 or P2 user to be able to enable your security defaults. Security defaults is super important because it's those set of policies that Microsoft has enabled to protect you even from basic cybersecurity and identity-based threats, essentially. So in order to enable this, once you have access to your Entra Admin Center, you will go to Properties, and from the Properties section, right at the bottom here, you will then be able to see the security defaults here, and you can then select Manage Security Default and make sure that that's enabled. And then you have a little write-up here where Microsoft tells you that 99% of account compromises could be stopped by using multi-factor authentication, and this is a feature that security defaults provides. But let's look a little bit deeper at what security defaults provide. Now, if you click this Learn More button, you will get access to this page over here, which basically describes the details of security defaults in Microsoft Entra ID. Now, it helps to make it easier to protect your organization from identity-related attacks, right? So we're talking password sprays, common phishing attacks, and those types of things that we see very prominent in today's cybersecurity and threat landscape. Security defaults are pre-configured, and you cannot customize the security default. So it's either you will enable or disable the security defaults. Now, one thing that is really important to note is that when you are using other capabilities in the platform, like when you have an Entra ID P1 or P2 license, then you may be electing to use conditional access, and in this case, security defaults may not be required. Now, let's have a look at enabling. So we've taken you through the steps of enabling security defaults, but then when we look at when it is required, you can see that when we look at the deployment considerations, now here, if we look at the different authentication methods, you can see that basically by disabling security defaults, you get a few settings. But if we move from security defaults to conditional access, this is where the license change comes in. So for security defaults, you have no license requirement, versus for conditional access, you have an intra-IDP 1 license requirement. So that's super important to note. And if you are using conditional access, as we said, there are certain conditional access policies that you can enforce, and then security defaults may not be as applicable to you. So it's really kind of that configuration between when you're using security defaults versus conditional access, with conditional access providing that additional granularity, which we will talk about in the next section. Next, we'll look at conditional access policies, which helps to strengthen your security by adaptation to risk. All right, what does this mean? So conditional access is one of the most effective ways to prevent unauthorized access by dynamically adapting security requirements to the risk level of each access attempt. So whether it's an employee that's trying to log in from an unknown location or from an unknown or unmanaged device, conditional access policies allows you to apply real-time controls that adjust based on the situation of the user, the location of the user, or the adapted risk. Let's look at this in a real world scenario. So think of a remote employee that logs into a computer from an unusual location while traveling, and their device hasn't really had any security updates in the last month. Without conditional access, they could be unknowingly opening the door to an attacker. In this case, by using conditional access, you can actually block access entirely, or you can require multi-factor authentication if a sign-in occurs from an untrusted location or device. And in addition, you can also limit access to sensitive applications from corporate devices only. So if you think of an application like your payroll system, you only want access from a managed corporate device. That can be achieved through enabling the correct and efficient conditional access policies. Now, some common policy examples are the ability to require multi-factor authentication for any login attempts from what occurs outside or from an untrusted network. You can also restrict access to sensitive applications from unmanaged or non-compliant devices. Let's have a look at how you can enable and configure conditional access policies to ensure that these policies are applicable to specifically your organizational requirements and to enhance your identity protection even further. Now, to recap, conditional access policies is available to you if you have a Microsoft Entra ID P1 license, of course P2 as well, but on the free license you cannot do this. So if you are an organization that has an E3 user base, you will have an Entra ID P1 license. If you have an E5 user base, you will have an Entra ID P2 license. Then we have all the additional capabilities split between E3 and E5, so P1 and P2, right? So from a conditional access policy, so conditional access policies are configurable again in the Entra ID portal, so intra.microsoft.com. Once you log into the portal and you hit the landing page, you will expand Protect over here, and then you'll navigate to conditional access. Now, underneath the conditional access section, there's a bunch of things that you can do. So firstly, if we get started with the policy section, now there are a couple of default conditions and it tells you what conditional access is. But if we look at configuring a new policy here, let's talk through a few of the attributes that's available. So there are really two main sections here. So section 1 is the assignment. So this is what you can basically target as your assignment. So either a user account, a target resource, the network, and then you can set certain conditions for this. So if it is based on this device, or if it is based on this user condition, etc. And then you can decide what must be done. So what is the control that you would like to enforce? So let's look at this a little bit deeper. So from a user perspective, you can decide where to apply this policy to. So you can either apply this as kind of a generic policy across your entire user base. So then you'd select all users, or you'd have selected users or groups, etc. Now, we always advocate for group-based management as opposed to user-selected management. The next section here is basically the target resources. So now you can consider this as the application landscape that you'd like to target. So perhaps you want to apply this policy across everything except for Microsoft Teams. And this is where you can then apply it either to selected apps, or you can apply to all apps, and you can exclude Microsoft Teams in this case. The next section is around the network. Now, here's where it gets really granular. So you can enable network configuration. So if you are located, let's say, in 2 defined places across the world, and you know your network subnets across those places, and you know which IP address ranges users are going to be connecting from, then you can select those as trusted networks, or you can select the policy to apply multi-factor authentication sign-ins or a prompt for multi-factor authentication if users sign in from anything except that network. And this is where you will add it in the exclusion section. Then the next one is the conditions. So the conditions is basically if what happens. So in the user section, so if the user is a high-risk user, as an example, then you might want to invoke something like a password reset. Or if a user is a medium risk, then you may just want to notify or prompt for multi-factor authentication. The next part is around the sign-in risk. So if a user is signing in and there's a sign-in risk detected that that user is signing in from 2 different locations around the world within a 10-minute time frame, that's physically impossible, right? So that's where you will likely detect a sign-in risk. And this is really important because the sign-in risk allows you to set the action based on that sign-in. So if you want to completely block that user from accessing, or if you want to prompt again for multi-factor authentication. Then we have further conditions like the insider risk or the device platforms. The device platforms is also really interesting. So if a user is connecting from, let's say, an iPhone type of device, you might want to prompt for additional factor, or from Android, you might want to prompt for additional factor. So all of these are considerations when it comes to the conditions that you have available here. Then when it comes to access controls, you can now decide what you want to do in terms of access controls. So do you want to entirely block access, or do you want to grant access based on a few conditions? So if a user is, like you configured, a high risk user and they're coming from a specific network, then you might want to prompt for multi-factor authentication. Or if a user is a high risk user and they have a risky sign-in, then you might want to prompt them for a password change. And this is really the behavioral shift that we can see in terms of truly getting to that proactive security, where you don't have to go and investigate if that user is a high risk, but you can identify this based on these types of conditional access policies. And for that user that's sitting and working from the cafe that we mentioned earlier on, they could have already received something like a multi-factor authentication, or they could have been blocked from accessing completely sensitive resources because they're coming from an unknown network. That is the power of conditional access policies. Let's talk about some best practices for access controls to help you prevent some of the most common threats. Now, even with the right tools in place, it's really important to adopt best practices to minimize the risks to your organization and to maintain a strong and secure authentication and integrity and confidential environment, right? So the first thing is to conduct regular access reviews. So to ensure that users only have access to the resources they need by conducting regular audits. Then you also want to consider the principle of least privilege. So users should absolutely only have the minimum level of access required to perform their job. So specifically to their role, which limits the impact of a potential breach or a confidentiality issue. Now, you should also be using group-based access. So managing access by groups instead of individuals streamlines permissions and it reduces the likelihood of mistakes. Now, let's look at a real-world scenario here. So employees who have left an organization can still retain access to sensitive applications, or employees in unrelated departments can access financial or confidential data that they really shouldn't have access to. In this case, the solution would be to regularly review access rights and apply group-based permissions to ensure that access is properly limited and easy to manage. Now, let's move a little bit and look into advanced identity protection, which is included in Microsoft 365 E5. If your business uses Microsoft 365 E5, you have access to the identity protection capability, which adds advanced risk detection and automated responses to suspicious activities. Now, let's look at a problem statement which would be addressed by identity protection. So, an employee's credentials are stolen and used in a risky sign-in from an unknown location. Without detection and response in place, an attacker could access sensitive information and sensitive company data by using this employee's stolen credentials. Now, the solution from an identity protection perspective here would be to simply automatically block risky sign-ins or to require an additional authentication factor based on the risk analysis. So if it's identified that that credential is logging in from an unknown device or an unknown location, then invoking the conditional access policies automatically based on the identity protection capability. Using machine learning to identify patterns that indicate compromised credentials or abnormal behavior. Now, why does it matter? Why is this important to you? With identity protection, threats are detected and mitigated before they cause harm. So that's really important. It's about shifting from that reactive to proactive. So this proactive approach reduces your risk of falling victim to account takeovers and ultimately data breaches. Next up, let's have a look at monitoring and auditing in Entra ID. Now, monitoring and auditing user access is really important for identifying suspicious activity and helping you to respond quickly to any suspicious incidents or events. Entra ID provides a comprehensive visibility platform into who is accessing your resources, from where, and under what conditions. Think about the problem statement. If you notice a spike in unusual logins from an abroad location, but without audit logs, you have no way of determining whether these activities are actually legitimate or whether they may be malicious. Now, in this case, monitoring helps. So, using the sign-in logs to track user activities and flag unusual access patterns will help you to be able to identify this unusual behavior. Then the audit logs lets you see changes to permissions and user accounts, which helps you to identify potential security issues much earlier. And additionally, for E5 users, you can further enhance your security with Microsoft Sentinel. Now, Sentinel is a cloud-native security information and event management tool that provides advanced threat detection and response across your entire environment. Microsoft Sentinel integrates seamlessly with Entra ID, giving you a centralized view of security events across your network. So it uses capabilities of AI and machine learning to detect threats in near real time, correlating signals from across your cloud and on-premise environments to identify any types of anomalies in potential attacks. Now, for E5 users, there are a couple of additional benefits. Think about proactive threat detection. Sentinel can automatically analyze logs from Entra ID, conditional access, and other Microsoft 365 services to detect suspicious activities like coordinated attack patterns. Then there is also the automated incident response capabilities. So Sentinel doesn't just alert you to threats. It can automatically trigger response workflows based on detected risks. So as an example, if Sentinel identifies a compromised account, it can immediately block the user and notify your security team of this potential compromised account. Then there's advanced analytics and AI. So Sentinel uses machine learning to improve threat detection over time. So it's really this learning and improving scenario where it ensures that you stay ahead of emerging cyber threats because Sentinel continues to improve and learn, improve and learn. Then we also have customizable dashboards. Now, monitoring near real-time data through customizable dashboards that gives you really that comparative view of your overall risk exposure and your overall security landscape in your organization. We've covered how to strengthen your access control with conditional access, security defaults, and advanced tools like identity protection. For E5 users, we've also explored how Microsoft Sentinel can provide automated threat detection and incident response, taking your security monitoring to the next level. Stay tuned for our next episode where we will take a deeper dive into threat detection with Microsoft 365. Until then, don't forget to check out the Also Cloud Marketplace for more tools and information on how to secure your digital workplace. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay vigilant and stay secure.